Hey, it's Mr. Powell. I wanted to sort of summarize our reading today. Um, Started on page 25. This is for English 11 honors, and we were reading Walden starting on page 25. Just want to remind anybody that's at home that we have a test on Wednesday on Frankenstein, and we spent a minute just reviewing the kinds of things that you need to look at. You need to look at the PowerPoint lecture notes. There'll be questions about that. There'll be questions about places in the novel, about characters in the novel, about events in the novel. And but most of the questions will come from the essay questions at the end of the review sheet. And so those will be either short answer or longer answers. There will be an essay, but the whole test has to be taken within a 55-minute period, so it'll be a rather short essay. But we spent just a few minutes, and that'll be on Wednesday. We just continued to read the first chapter in Walden called Economy, and we started on page 25, and I just thought I would summarize that briefly. In the book, he has, in this first chapter, he has spent some time talking about the four essentials that every man needs to just maintain life. And those four essentials are food, shelter, clothing, and fuel. All these were on page 14. And so he takes up each one of them over the next few pages. And he started with clothing, and now he's talking about shelter. So the section we read today was about shelter. And he starts by saying that there are some places on page 25 that, particularly depending on where you live, if in the warmer climates, you don't even need any shelter, that your clothes are your shelter. Even then, he pointed out that some places near the equator, the skin are your clothes. You don't really need clothes or shelter. And he makes exceptions in that clothes are necessary for modesty. And that there are places where you need shelter because of the temperature. He mentions on page 26 that it's natural. Every child naturally wants to be outside. He wants to play outside, even in cold weather or rainy weather. He'd rather be outside than inside. So there's something instinctive in us that wants to be outside, that tries to get out of the house. He mentioned on page 26, certain Indians lived in the snow in thin cotton tents, and you would think they would have been much more comfortable in larger, more comfortable houses, but they weren't. He also talks about the fact that, people, the Indians, American Indians, lived in wigwams, which they owned, as opposed to many Americans who rent larger dwellings, but they don't own those larger dwellings, or they work for years paying off the mortgage of a house that they do own. And of course, you never really own a house until you pay it off. And so he was saying, which is better off, the Indian who works in who lives in a wigwam but he owns it, or the other man who lives in a bigger, nicer house but he never really owns it. And so that's one of the things he mentions on page 27. He talks about the lack of necessity to own bigger houses, that he's always about the minimal aspect of it. So what he wants to do is provide a shelter if you need one, but not spend your entire life working for the house. Then he points out, do you own the house, or does the house own you, since you're working for the house? He would rather not have a big house and live life according to his own dictates, which means something. The whole book is based on what that means. What does it mean to live life? But it's not making or paying for the necessities. That's why you take care of the necessities and you minimize them. He also talks about, he continues to dwell on this fact that if we develop on page 30 our houses and build better houses, even palaces, he says, but is it not as easy to build better people, to build noblemen and kings? He says that if the civilized pursuits are no worthier than a savage's, if he has employed the greater part of his life obtaining gross necessities and comfort merely, why should we have a better dwelling than the former? So if you're spending your life building a house, but you're not building your life, then he says that's a problem. And we read all the way to page 32, and he begins to talk about we not only live and work for houses that are bigger than we need, but we covet other people's houses that are bigger than ours. So he spends the entire passage, these 8 or 10 pages that we read, just pointing out how we could live on much less. And just like he mentioned with clothes, that it's not the amount of clothes or how fancy the clothes are. In fact, you shouldn't buy new clothes until you've changed the man inside. That would be what, in his mind, would make sense. So we answered just, well, I don't think we answered any of the questions yet because we were still working on them. But that, hopefully, if you read this at home, those pages, it might make more sense. It's not easy to read. We will read to page 35 on Thursday when we get back to this, and then begin a brand new chapter after that. So please, if you're at home, please study for the exam or the test, and we'll talk about whether you're going to take it at home online or when you get back to school. So this is 11 Honors Literature. Thank you for listening. Hopefully that was helpful.